Hey everybody, this is a piece titled The Peculiar Appeal of the quote, Jewish Question, The Case of Left Antisemitism by Lars Rensmann. It was published in fall 2019 in the journal Antisemitism Studies, Volume 3, Number 2, published by Indiana University Press. And here we go. Actually, let me read Lars Rensmann's bio. Lars Rensmann is professor of European politics and society at the University of Groningen, where he also serves as the director of the Research Center for the Study of Democratic Cultures and Politics, and is chair of the Department of European Languages and Cultures. He is also a permanent fellow at the Moses Mendelssohn Center for European Jewish Studies at the University of Potsdam. His recent books include The Politics of Unreason, The Frankfurt School and Antisemitism, published by SUNY Press in 2017, Arendt and Adorno, Political and Philosophical Investigations, co-edited with Samir Gandesha, Stanford University Press 2012, Politics and Resentment, Antisemitism and Counter-Cosmopolitanism in the European Union, co-edited with Julius H. Schütz, published by Brill in 2011, and Gaming the World, How Sports Are Reshaping Global Politics and Culture, co-authored with Andrei S. Markovits with Princeton University Press in 2010. So that's the end of his bio. Now we'll read the actual paper. The Peculiar Appeal of the, quote, Jewish Question, end quote. The Case of Left Antisemitism by Lars Rensmann. This is the abstract. Antisemitism on the left remains a controversial subject of scholarly research. Analyzing the recent studies by David Hirsch and by Robert Fine and Philip Spencer, this article examines their contribution to a critical understanding of the debate surrounding left antisemitism, past and present, as well as their origins and historical and ideational trajectories. The two studies illuminate the specific patterns of justification, rationalization, and distorted universalism by which anti-Jewish hostility emerged and developed in left-wing contexts, shedding light on the particular ways the, quote, Jewish question has been posed recurringly on the left. Moreover, this research shows how leftist anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism denial, cloaked in discourses of progressivism, have helped facilitate what Hirsch calls, quote, the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, end quote, today. Okay, that's the end of the abstract. Now, after all this time, we'll actually read the thing. Over the last 15 years, the contexts of public and scholarly debates about anti-Semitism have changed quite dramatically. On the one hand, political and public anti-Semitism are back in full force, far from being limited to the fringes or undercurrents of global society. Scholarship has to confront this fact, which renders long persistent claims about the, quote, disappearance of anti-Semitism, end quote, and its alleged, quote, replacement, end quote, by other resentments, political fiction. There is a visible comeback of radical, often overt, unfiltered, unrestrained, and violent anti-Semitism in societies around the globe, and the scope of this is arguably unprecedented in the post-Holocaust era. This rise includes the recent reinforcement and intensification of government-sponsored anti-Semitism. States like Iran, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Qatar openly promote Jew hatred. Defying all human rights rhetoric and the conventions of our century, they spread anti-Semitic conspiracy myths, like the century-old, still widely circulated anti-Jewish forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Verbal and aggressive annihilationist anti-Semitism is also proliferating, quote, bottom up, end quote, through new, transnational digital publics, on the internet and through social media, in democracies and autocracies alike. Hate speech, anti-Jewish boycotts, and anti-Semitic conspiracy myths have become a normalized part of public communication in a dramatically restructured digital public sphere. Hereby, they seem to steadily gain in social acceptability. Much of this hatred is directed against citizens of Israel and the Jewish state they call home. The new level of uninhibited and widely disseminated global anti-Semitism has resurged in all types of social organizations, institutions, including the United Nations, social media, political groups, governments, European populist and even mainstream political parties. It poses a distinct challenge for global security and constitutes a pressing task for academic research on contemporary anti-Semitism, especially if anti-Semitism research is also driven by the goal to combat the subject, one that is often still denied in the academic mainstream and the general public. On the other hand, anti-Semitism, though still an institutionally marginalized topic in academia, has increasingly become the subject of scholarly debate in recent years. These debates have created some space for renewed and reinvigorated academic inquiry, self-reflection, and critique. Several established scholars have thereby returned to researching the resurgent anti-Semitic challenge and its origins, which, as indicated, goes far beyond the usual suspects of the radical right, alongside new cohorts of researchers recognizing the pressing need for more systematic work on an all-too-present problem. The two books to be discussed are Robert Fine and Philip Spencer's Anti-Semitism and the Left on the Return of the Jewish Question, published by Manchester University Press in 2017, and David Hirsch's Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, Routledge, 2018. Written by three of the most prominent and important academic voices against anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom, the books confront this new reality in both contemporary and historical perspective. Robert Fine, who passed away last year shortly after the book's publication, Philip Spencer, and David Hirsch all share a progressive, left-liberal background in addition to their scholarly achievements as social scientists. I would say Robert Fine's background is a little more radical than left-liberal, and I think that's also the case with Philip Spencer. And I believe the left-liberal background is probably more appropriate for David Hirsch. That is to say, in political and normative terms, these scholars have a long track record of publicly siding with cosmopolitan universalism against ethnic nationalism, supporting feminism, gay, transgender, and minority rights, advocating for pluralistic, multicultural democracies and robust civil and human rights, and criticizing the profound socioeconomic divisions that have been generated by an increasingly unregulated capitalist market economy, which has led to corporate monopolies and concentrations of wealth. These markers of leftist or, quote, progressive values, end quote, make the authors especially compelling analysts and critics of a still largely sidelined subject of social research and theorizing. anti-Semitism on the left and left-wing thinking about anti-Semitism, and the, quote, anti-Jewish question, end quote. Yet, none of the aforementioned progressive views and values would protect these authors from themselves being fiercely criticized at times in the UK within the left, simply for researching this most negated, if not taboo, topic of anti-Semitism on the left. Not surprisingly, all three authors understand anti-Semitism research as work that entails the goal of curtailing anti-Semitism, and rightly so. Thus, they are, quote, participant observers, end quote, and engaged scholars in the best sense of the word, not, quote, disinterested, but, quote, involved, end quote, with regard to universalism, democracy, the left, and the challenge of anti-Semitism. In their own ways, the books Anti-Semitism and the Left and Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism tackle the relationship between the left and anti-Semitism as a problem that is both a particular, quote, force field and linked to the broader societal context. To understand the meaning of anti-Semitism in its relationship to left-wing ideologies, actors, identities, or self-understandings, distinct research designs, tools, and methodological reflections may be warranted. Yet it is also important to situate left anti-Semitism and left-wing reflections of the, quote, anti-Jewish question, end quote, in the horizon of past and present societal trends. Fine and Spencer seek to reconstruct the often complex and historically ambivalent relationship between anti-Semitism and left-wing politics and thought in view of the history of ideas, as well as their import for present-day critique or self-reflection, while Hirsch offers an insightful, rich study of the distinct features, manifestations, and origins of, quote, contemporary left anti-Semitism, end quote, in the UK and beyond. Enlightenment, Marxism, Critical Theory, and Anti-Semitism, reflecting on, quote, the Jewish question, in left-wing theory and practice, past and present. In the very dense introduction to Anti-Semitism and the Left, Fine and Spencer set out a theoretical and normative framework for their study, against the backdrop of what they call the, quote, two faces of universalism, end quote. Fine and Spencer ambitiously yet concisely conceptualize the general as well as particular features of modern anti-Semitism, and how these are historically actualized or configured in left variants or treatments of the subject. Responding to critical theory's different sensitive universalism, Fine and Spencer suggest that it is necessary to understand the double nature of universalism in general and in relation to Jewish experience in particular. They make the persuasive claim that universalism constitutes an uncircumventable emancipatory principle of human inclusion. Notwithstanding this quality, however, universalism has historically advanced oppression and persecution by defaming entire groups of people as not fully human or inhuman, as already, quote, in the language of Roman law, as, quote, enemies of the human species, end quote. Hostis generis humani, end quote. Universalism can thus also have a, quote, repressive face, end quote, as embodied by its frequent use, quote, as a means of stigmatizing, excluding, and at times eliminating the, quote, other, end quote. Quote, as a means of stigmatizing, excluding, and at times eliminating the, quote, other, end quote. In the name of the universal. But while universalism's inclusive potential would arguably be lost if it is reduced to an unreachable, quote, abstract ideal, detached from its social reality, quote, the idea that it is always exclusive and exclusionary, end quote, would throw the baby out with the bath water. Such an absolute negation of the emancipatory qualities of universalist claims, a rejection all too typical for post-colonial left identity politics. One may add, quote, threatens to abandon any idea of universal human solidarity, end quote. The current crisis of universalism, which was emboldened in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the crimes against humanity committed against the European Jews, and the return of repressive illiberal nationalism are in fact, quote, deepened by a radicalism that would turn its back on the universal, bracket, and constitutional democracy, I would add, end bracket, and treats it at best as a subterfuge, at worst as a weapon of mass destruction, end quote. The principle of universalism challenges the legitimacy of all forms of exclusion. For instance, by means of human rights and their legal political appropriation. While the practice of this principle needs to be consistently critically reflected to avoid its historical and present misuse, the, quote, distorted face of universalism, end quote. Until today, such distorted universalism cloaks exclusions, particularisms, and hate speech against, quote, enemies of humankind, end quote, in cosmopolitan frames and discourses of universal justice. And this especially affects anti-Semitic denunciations that dehumanize Jews, Jewish life, Israelis, and Israeli society. For instance, absorbing and replicating old anti-Semitic tropes of Jews as the inhuman, quote, enemy of the world, end quote. Demonizations of Israel often single the Jewish state out as the main, quote, enemy of world peace, end quote. Using cosmopolitan language and rhetoric in such demonizations, the democratic Jewish state is also hyperbolically portrayed as the, quote, worst human rights perpetrator in the world, end quote, if not accused of, quote, Nazi genocide, end quote. Fine and Spencer's understanding of the two faces of universalism grounds their critique of the universal and particular dimensions of anti-Semitism, and it points to the twofold Jewish experiences of universalism in modern society. These experiences, Fine and Spencer argue, quote, have been correspondingly equivocal. Universalism has acted as a stimulus for Jewish emancipation, end quote, and societal inclusion, but powerful anti-Jewish universalistic narratives before and since the Enlightenment have peculiarly constructed Jews as the other of the universal and of humanity, as those evil, quote, enemies of humankind, end quote, who allegedly do not belong or want to belong, as the personification either of a stubborn, quote, particularism opposed to the universal, or of a false universalism concealing Jewish self-interest, end quote. The, quote, Jewish question is not a question but a collective pseudo-universalistic defamation, quote, whose answers are the pre-given conditions of the question itself, end quote. It always signifies, quote, an asymmetric relation of others to Jews, end quote, and, quote, keeps reappearing in different shapes at different times in different places, end quote. In all cases across time and space, this, quote, Jewish question is an anti-Semitic question. It tears apart the universal and particular dimensions of the human condition and puts them in stark, objectified opposition. It points to a, quote, reified cosmopolitanism that is set against the alleged particularism of the Jews, end quote. Presenting Jewish particularity, Fine and Spencer observe, collectively is, quote, incompatible with human universality, end quote. Jews are accused of ruthlessly pursuing their particular secret interest. In the anti-Semitic imagination, Jews are targeted as resilient particularists endangering universal human values and harmful to, quote, humanity as a whole, end quote. Yet, Jews are also labeled as bad universalists who are incompatible with or alien to particular communal life. In the anti-Semitic lens, they are simultaneously attacked as rootless cosmopolitan elites and fifth columns who collectively seek to, quote, decompose or destroy particular communal bonds, quote, the people, quote, the Aryans, quote, the Germans, quote, the British, quote, the Palestinian people, or, quote, the left, and as a, quote, chosen people, who are allegedly incapable of being like everyone else, proper human beings. Fine and Spencer argue that the modern articulation and reconfigurations of the, quote, Jewish question, which has multiple generalizable affinities to other collective resentments but also very specific features and functions, currently find an expression in left anti-Semitism, among other currently forcefully re-emerging, quote, distinct political sites, end quote, including Islamist and nationalist anti-Semitism. But the authors also engender our understanding of the particular trajectories, modes, justifications, and historical criticisms of anti-Semitism in the context of the left, as well as its forceful appeal within this political environment. For Fine and Spencer, we should avoid simple generalizations about the past and present of the left as totally anti-Semitic or free of anti-Semitism altogether. The modern left tradition has been, quote, split over the anti-Semitism question, playing a role both in, quote, representing, quote, the Jews as the enemy of humanity and in combating the prejudices of those who see Jews through this lens, end quote. While this historical image may give the modern left too much historical credit, even the leftist resistance movements during World War II hardly ever addressed the Nazi persecution of the European Jews. Fine and Spencer acutely observe in this book the now dominant refrain largely shaping left-wing views and discourses on the problem of anti-Semitism, deep within, for instance, the current Labour Party in the UK. That anti-Semitism is a problem of the past that no longer matters in comparison to, quote, Islamophobia and other racisms. That it was a historical European problem that never resonated in the Islamic world. That anti-Semitism is, quote, understandable given the way the Zionists behave, end quote. A recent poster at a left-wing rally in the UK read, quote, Israel provokes anti-Semitism, end quote. And that the Jewish state and its supporters are, quote, the main source of racism in the modern world, end quote. And that, quote, Zionists, end quote, cry anti-Semitism in bad faith, allegedly a charge mainly, quote, put forward for dishonest and self-seeking reasons, end quote, in order to, quote, deflect criticism of Israel, end quote, and, quote, in order to shut down debate on Israel, end quote. Fine and Spencer's book not only challenges a political culture and scholars who misrecognize, downplay, and deny and disseminate anti-Semitism on the left. It also criticizes several problematic underlying methodological assumptions nurturing those flawed perceptions of anti-Semitism. First, they criticize a, quote, methodological separatism, end quote, obscuring links between anti-Semitism and racism entirely. While Fine and Spencer agree that both are also distinct phenomena serving different functions, anti-Semitism, for instance, serves as a reified world explanation, identifying Jews with money, economic harms resulting from capitalism, political harm through wars, and a secret global conspiracy, or abstract intellectualism's, quote, decomposing cultural homogeneity. They object to rigorous disconnections and selective universalisms, treating Jewish victims of discrimination a priori different than others, as exemplified by an alarmed response to racism or, quote, Islamophobia, while, quote, charges of anti-Semitism are commonly viewed with suspicion on the left today. Second, the authors problematize what they call, quote, methodological historicism, end quote, which positions Judeophobia a priori as a problem of the past long irrelevant and discredited, which undermines the critical capacity and openness to recognize old and new forms in the present. Third, Fine and Spencer challenge a now widespread, quote, methodological dualism in left-wing thought and scholarship. Such dualism or binary Manichaean thinking situates questions of racism and anti-Semitism in a rigidly bifurcated worldview of good and evil, oppressor and oppressed, which Hirsch calls the, quote, politics of position, end quote, in an absolutist ideological and moral sense. Such dualism or campism drives theorists like Judith Butler to, quote, declare that Hamas and Hezbollah belong to the camp of anti-imperialism, end quote, and should be supported despite their hatred for civil rights, democracy, gays, and especially Jews. In this lens, racism is viewed as an expression of colonial oppressive power, but anti-Semitism is either downplayed or could be glorified as resistance. This was written before the October 7th pogrom by 4 years. Fourth, Fine and Spencer perceptively criticize what I call selective universalism. Quote, a cosmopolitan critique of methodological nationalism that reinstates precisely what it criticizes when it singles out one form of nationalism, end quote. That is, Jewish nationalism, while having little trouble with other nationalisms, such as Palestinian nationalism. An actual cosmopolitan critique of methodological nationalism is hereby replaced by, quote, a simulacrum of cosmopolitanism, end quote, that singles out Israel and turns Zionism into, quote, the universal equivalent of the deficiencies of all nationalism, end quote, in order to reproduce, quote, old stereotypes about the, quote, tribalism of the Jews, end quote. Often, anti-Semitism returns brazenly today. Fine and Spencer observe, quote, in the forms of physical attacks on Jews qua Jews, or on Jewish institutions. More often, it slips into our political culture through the notion that something must be done to deal with the harm of the Jewish state, the Jewish nation, or its Jewish supporters are alleged to inflict on humanity at large, end quote. In the book's 6 chapters, Fine and Spencer think through anti-Semitism and contestations as well as critiques of anti-Semitism in the history of ideas. In so doing, they scrutinize especially the relationship between the left in its historical, genealogical, and theoretical trajectories, and the anti-Semitic, quote, Jewish question. In a short chapter engaging with conflictual approaches to Jewish emancipation within the context of a presumably, quote, universalistic Enlightenment thinking, in the context of presumably, quote, universalistic Enlightenment thinking, the authors contrast Christian von Daum with Moses Mendelssohn against the background of Hannah Arendt's early essay on Enlightenment and the Jewish Question, published in 1932. Daum posed his argument for Jewish political emancipation and civil rights in terms of, quote, solving the Jewish question, end quote. Arendt analyzed Daum as mirroring a dominant, liberal Enlightenment consciousness, also reflected in the cosmopolitan Enlightenment philosopher Kant, who contraposed, quote, universalism to the Jews, end quote, according to which, quote, even the Jews, end quote, understood as a homogeneous and inferior collective entity, quote, could be improved by a regime of equal citizenship, end quote. In contrast to Daum's conditional argument for Jewish emancipation, Mendelssohn rejected the idea that the Jews need improvement, as Fine and Spencer point out, and that there was, quote, anything in the observance of Jewish law that was not compatible with the imperatives of philosophical universalism, end quote. In fact, Mendelssohn was among the first to address the dangers of such failed Enlightenment thinking that made Jewish emancipation conditional on their, quote, improvement, and saw the, quote, Jewish question as a problem in need of a solution, thereby turning, quote, the Jews into the reified, personified embodiment of all problems in European societies. This discussion about Jewish emancipation and false universalism sets the stage for the confrontation between Karl Marx and Bruno Bauer in the 19th century. Inevitably, a study of the left and anti-Semitism in the context of the history of ideas also has to return to and reread Marx, and particularly his essay on the Jewish question and his critique of Bauer. On the one hand, Fine and Spencer argue against an apologetic Marxist view that ignores Marx's, quote, occasional use of anti-Jewish epithets, end quote. On the other hand, Fine and Spencer argue that Marx was not anti-Semitic but confronted, quote, anti-Judaic and anti-Semitic currents running through, quote, the left, end quote, end quote. For Fine and Spencer, Marx first and foremost provides an innovative and original critique of the, quote, Jewish question as a problem in need of a solution, in stark opposition to Bruno Bauer. In contrast to Bauer and much of the Enlightenment tradition, Fine and Spencer remind us that Marx, quote, supported Jewish emancipation unequivocally and without conditions, end quote. Quoting him, quote, we do not tell the Jews that they cannot be emancipated politically without radically emancipating themselves from Judaism, which is what Bauer tells them, end quote. While Fine and Spencer do not suggest, quote, there is nothing in any of Marx and Engels' conception of human emancipation that was not open to being read through the lens of the Jewish question, end quote, and as an emancipation from every kind of particularity, it was Bauer and the Marxists following in his footsteps for whom, quote, human emancipation was premised on imagining a, quote, world without Jews, end quote, end quote. Marx and Engels, argue Fine and Spencer, had a much less repressive vision. A, quote, real humanism, end quote, that defends Jewish emancipation against the Jewish question, a humanism that is, quote, predicated on recognizing the humanity of Jews and their individuality, that is, in their empirical life, work, and relationships, end quote, not based on excluding, quote, the Jews, end quote, for failing some test of human universality, end quote. For the most part, I find Fine and Spencer's argument convincing that Karl Marx is a child of the Enlightenment who struggled to, quote, emancipate the Enlightenment from its own anti-Judaic prejudices, end quote, and can be seen as an important resource for recovering a left-wing tradition of critical thought that challenges left anti-Semitism, notwithstanding the fact that his writings on human emancipation and the Jewish question could be misappropriated due to some ambiguities for which Marx is responsible, and which, quote, allowed the Jewish question to be smuggled back in, end quote. That his early essays, quote, ushered in a lifelong critique of anti-Semitism, end quote, however, may be pushing the defense of Marx a bit too far. I would argue that Marx was simply much more concerned with other questions, most prominently the social question, that partly pushed this critique, though evident, to the side. In the following third chapter, Fine and Spencer engage with critical theory in 20th century Marxism. While I found this chapter the least innovative and thought-provoking in the book, the proposed nuanced interpretation of Max Horkheimer and Theodor W. Adorno's work in the 1940s is persuasive. Fine and Spencer note that Horkheimer and Adorno recognized the gravity of the persecution of Jews as an evolving social phenomenon, casting a very dark shadow on the claim that history, quote, is proceeding, quote, inevitably, ... in a progressive direction, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno's work is rightly contrasted to the writings of Neumann, who stuck to the Marxist argument that anti-Semitism was only a means or technique to consolidate capitalist or Nazi totalitarian domination. Unfortunately, the chapter fails to deal with much of the more current research on the Frankfurt School, anti-Semitism, and the, quote, Jewish question, published over the last decade that has changed our understanding of the Frankfurt School. However, the chapter adds an interesting contextual argument explaining how other strands of 20th century Marxism evolved into a, quote, devaluing of cosmopolitanism and revaluing of the Jewish question, end quote, eroding leftist opposition to anti-Semitism and making, quote, its own contribution to the anti-Semitic canon, end quote. After Marx, Orthodox Marxism had taken a decidedly nationalist turn. This is also noted, as we shall see later, by Hirsch. Many left Zionist, Jewish Bolsheviks were murdered in the Stalinist terror of the 1930s. This also culminated in the communist Stalinist refusal to face up to Nazi genocidal anti-Semitism in any way, while Jews were continuously charged with, quote, Zionism and, quote, cosmopolitanism after the Holocaust. But even left-wing Marxism largely ignored the Holocaust, downplayed anti-Semitism and the Nazi extermination of the Jews, and soon started to equate all kinds of alleged injustices, including Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, with the Nazi atrocities against the Jews. One negative climax of this development was the bombing of a Jewish community center by German radical leftists on the 21st anniversary of the November pogrom, Kristallnacht, in 1969, in the name of anti-Zionism. For much of the left by then, the Jewish nation came to be seen as the worst genocidal perpetrator and the, quote, archetypal perpetrator of imperialist crimes. Quote, the Jews became the new Nazis, end quote. Fine and Spencer point out that part of Horkheimer and Adorno's opposition to the New Left and the radical student movement stems from this return of the, quote, Jewish question. While it is rather questionable to place Hannah Arendt within the context of the left, as Fine and Spencer do, the fourth chapter on the Jewish intellectual and political theorist is a welcome contribution to an ongoing scholarly and public debate on Arendt and anti-Semitism. Once again, Fine and Spencer bring nuance and reflexivity to an often polarized discussion, which has partly obscured rather than illuminated an understanding of Arendt's work. Her critique of Jewish nationalism, they argue, quote, was not at all incompatible with a strong sense of the rights of Jews, including the right of self-determination, end quote. Undoubtedly, Arendt was a controversial thinker with partly shifting political views and ambivalences about Zionism and Jewish politics. She provoked fury, often it seems deliberately, with some of her political writings. For Fine and Spencer, however, Arendt has been misused by advocates of anti-Zionism and partly misunderstood by her fiercest critics. She was, quote, haunted by recognition of the human condition of Jews after the Holocaust, which the return of the Jewish question was again threatening from within and without, end quote. While Fine and Spencer offer a compelling account of Arendt's thought and ambivalences, it is the chapter on Habermas, post-nationalism, and the distorted universalism of considerable parts of the contemporary European and American left that is arguably the most important and intriguing chapter of this book. While Habermas's political project is reconstructed as a critical and emancipatory program against the backdrop of a, quote, genuinely universalistic critique of European anti-Semitism, end quote, providing universalistic concepts and means of combating anti-Semitism, Fine and Spencer suggest that, quote, cracks in the post-national edifice allowed a different agenda to enter. It was to turn the Jewish nation into the, quote, other of the post-national, the personification of radical alterity, end quote. Among those corroding the critical content of Habermas's categories, quote, from within, according to Fine and Spencer, are the, quote, new critical theorist, end quote, like Judith Butler, who advance a particularistic, distorted universalism singling out the Jewish state and critics of anti-Semitism as particularists. A distorted universalism that claims to support a universalistic ethos, but suggests that focusing on anti-Semitism is an anachronism and that such a focus covers up the, quote, real racisms, end quote, today. What is worse is their suggestion that, quote, opposition to anti-Semitism has been consumed by a damaging particularism, and that a conspiratorial agenda lies behind the charge of anti-Semitism, end quote. Butler and some post-Marxist fellow travelers do not recognize current anti-Semitism. Fine and Spencer point out, but only detect, quote, the charge of anti-Semitism, end quote, which with its allegedly, quote, chilling effects, end quote, on debates, as they charge those who raise it with bad faith and argue that they ought to be combated politically. The key defect of this distorted universalism, Fine and Spencer insist, quote, does not lie in its theoretical claim to universalism, but in the ways it belies their claims in practice, end quote. Hereby, all too often, the distinction between nationalism and post-nationalism has indeed been turned, quote, into a categorical opposition that stigmatizes Jewish expressions of nationalism and represents Holocaust memory as culpably nationalistic, end quote, while third world nationalisms, including Palestinian nationalism, are viewed inversely as progressive and socialistic. Those who demonize the Jewish state, and only the Jewish state, in the name of universalism and who claim to be opposed to anti-Semitism, revive and reconfigure the, quote, Jewish question that forms the foundation of anti-Semitism in the first place. And thus they become blind towards their own anti-Semitism. In place of a critical theory in which the legacy of European anti-Semitism takes center stage, Fine and Spencer conclude, quote, we encounter resistance to the notion that anti-Semitism is any longer a problem for Europe, end quote. Among those, quote, whose universalism is actually deployed to bring the Jewish question back in, end quote. The final chapter of Fine and Spencer's excellent study turns specifically to the return and reconfiguration of the, quote, Jewish question in current anti-Israel discourses and representations of Zionism within the left, deconstructing the most common, grave, and egregious, quote, guilty verdicts against Israel on the left, the charge of genocide, the apartheid analogy, the charge that Israel is a, quote, major threat to world peace, end quote. Fine and Spencer argue that these charges, quote, have provided some of the emotional force behind the move to boycott Israel, end quote, and now behind the campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, which itself denies the Jewish state's right to exist and uses anti-Semitic tropes about Zionist control of the media. Just a side note, it's pretty funny on on the Jungle World website, the cosmopolitan left newspaper from Germany. They had a thing one of their like advertisements trying to get people to subscribe to the magazine said said BDSM, not BDS. I thought it was funny. The, quote, spiritless radicalism, end quote, of left anti-Zionism constructs the Jewish state as the main source of violence in the world, while Palestinians are constructed only as victims, and, quote, only as victims of Israel, end quote. Fine and Spencer conclude, quote, contempt for rights, lack of solidarity with victims, neglect of anti-Semitism, belief in the harmfulness of Jews, the marker of the old Jewish question are not absent in the new ... The return of the Jewish question involves a distortion of universalism that sees Jews as the problem and demands a solution to this problem. Today, this demand focuses on the exclusion of the Jewish nation from world society, end quote. The institutionalization of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on the left, the case of the UK and beyond. The specific analysis of manifestations of contemporary left anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the last chapter of Fine and Spencer's work is the starting point and subject of David Hirsch's major study. Hirsch has been working on this issue for many years, and his book is in multiple ways the comprehensive result of this long-term research agenda. The empirical richness of the study is, not surprisingly, impressive. It focuses, however, primarily on Great Britain. Hirsch's book is, as he aptly puts it, quote, about anti-Semitism in social spaces which think of themselves as anti-racist and democratic. It is about anti-Semitism amongst people who believe they strongly oppose anti-Semitism, end quote. Such, quote, bistro anti-Semitism, end quote, Ben Cohen, of a segment of the socio-political elite that thinks of itself as progressive or the, quote, good people, end quote, is usually, though certainly not exclusively, quote, related to hostility against Israel, end quote. In light of those self-understandings, it is hardly surprising that the very existence of this phenomenon is still, quote, angrily contested, end quote. While it has, in fact, long matured into a fully fledged, vigorously present anti-Zionism that has turned into an anti-Semitic worldview that is denied with similar vehemence by its agents. Like other forms of anti-Semitism, this worldview, quote, repositions Jewish wrongdoing at the center of all that is problematic in the world, end quote. Hirsch's work focuses primarily on the type of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism that thinks of itself as anti-racist. The jihadi and Islamist or Arab nationalist variants, for instance, are less concerned about distinguishing between anti-Zionism and overt racial anti-Semitism. Though he rightly argues that the repertoire of tropes travels between anti-racist and democratic, nationalist and Islamist, quote, fringe and mainstream spaces, different kinds of media, and the right, left, and political center, end quote. The author's critical analysis of left-wing anti-Semitism's many variations, denials and rationalizations, expressed in both generalizable features and in elements which seem more specific to left-wing discursive practices, is that hereby anchored in a sociological view that understands anti-Semitism as a social phenomenon rather than a matter of subjective attitudes or feelings. Hirsch suggests, however, that sociology can provide self-reflective resources and methods that can be used for understanding and then opposing contemporary anti-Semitism. In particular, the book is based on reconstructive empirical case studies of how anti-Semitism emerges, quote, out of the ostensible democratic discourse of criticism of Israel, end quote. In the cases studied, Hirsch identifies two key recurring mechanisms by which anti-Semitic lenses, quote, graduate into concrete discrimination within the discursive practice of contemporary left anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. This transition is facilitated, first, by campaigns for boycotts of Israel and Israelis aiming at their exclusion from, quote, the global community of humankind, end quote, anchored in the notion that the Jewish state is particularly evil, and second, by the increasingly ubiquitous, quote, generalization of an assumption of bad faith against those who oppose the demonization of Israel who oppose the anti-Semitism associated with it, end quote. Examining radical critiques of Israel and Zionism and, quote, how they tend to free themselves from empirical, rational, or comparative methodological constraints, end quote. Within left-wing discourses, Hirsch observes that contemporary left anti-Semitism is not the first anti-Semitism positioning itself as fiercely, self-righteously, and uncompromisingly siding with the alleged oppressed against alleged ruthless oppressors. The perception of constitutive socio-economic antagonisms has been part and parcel of Marxist theory and politics critical of class contradictions. As Fine and Spencer have shown, anti-Semitic reifications of such social oppositions, framed in the context of the, quote, Jewish question, have also been part of the Marxist and left tradition, as well as subject to internal and external criticism. Yet, as Hirsch observes, since World War II and with the rise of radical anti-Zionism at the end of the 1960s, Manichaean binary oppositions, often rigidly objectified, were reinforced. A reified anti-imperialism of fools that culturalizes societal contradictions and anti-Zionist identity politics increasingly dominated radical left thought and politics in relation to international politics. Absorbing Stalinist doctrines, within the left, a, quote, nationalist tradition of supporting whole nations, which are designated as oppressed, against whole nations which are designated as oppressor, end quote, has flourished since, and it has, ever more aggressively over the last decade, evolved to define Jews no longer as victims of exclusion and persecution, but, at home and abroad, as the, quote, bearers of white colonialism, end quote. Part of the cultural milieu of tolerated anti-Semitism in considerable parts of the left today can be understood against the background of these long-nurtured, locked-in, culturally reified, and to some extent discursively coercive, identitarian, quote, politics of position, end quote, that trump an enlightened, quote, politics of reason or persuasion, end quote. Consequently, if Jews are reluctant to embrace this hostility to Israel identity, they risk being expelled from what Hirsch calls the self-styled, quote, community of the good, end quote. In the first 3 chapters, Hirsch scrutinizes the relevance of this culture of contemporary left anti-Semitism in democratic spaces by examining the Labour Party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. He recognizes a major transformation of Labour under Corbyn from a democratic party to a primarily populist party open to anti-Semitism and conspiracy myths. However, this should be understood in its historical context. It could evolve due to long-lingering attitudes and milieus within Labour's left wing. Accordingly, the first chapter examines what Hirsch calls, in reference to the former mayor of London, the, quote, Livingstone formulation, end quote. The chapter is conceptual and historical. It deals with some of the historical origins and strands of the milieu within the Liberal Democrats and Labour. The particular Labour milieu is represented by Ken Livingstone. It recurrently employs what Hirsch has called the Livingstone formulation, namely, quote, responding to an accusation of anti-Semitism with a counter-accusation of Zionist bad faith, end quote. It can also be traced back to various sources in history and around the globe outside of this self-identified left. From Charles Lindbergh to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and radical right figures like David Duke and British National Party leader Nick Griffin. Hirsch brilliantly deconstructs the key elements of this widespread phenomenon as part of a discursive ideological strategy to immunize anti-Semitism from anti-Semitism charges and to, simultaneously and inversely, blame the Jews for inventing their discrimination to advance their political causes. The elements include the categorical refusal to discuss the substance of the charge of anti-Semitism and shift the debate onto the secret motive, cui bono, for the allegation. The anti-Semitic counter-accusation that the charge is made deliberately by Zionists in bad faith, not as an error of judgment, the blurring of all differences between hate speech vis-a-vis Israel and Israelis into legitimate criticism, suggesting that such, quote, criticism of Israel cannot be construed as anti-Semitic, end quote, and the allegation that this is part of a conspiracy, and that, quote, those who raise the issue of anti-Semitism are doing so as part of a common secret plan to silence such criticism, end quote. Yet, while this reactive discursive is both anti-Semitic and strategic, Hirsch argues convincingly that there is no necessary contradiction if a politician is unaware of feeling any hostility against Jews while indulging in classic anti-Semitic myths, because anti-Semitism is a, quote, objective social phenomenon, end quote, not only residing in our heads, but also in our cultural spaces, and, quote, in the relationship between consciousness, culture, and material reality, end quote. Hirsch shows how the self-victimizing Livingstone formulation and the underlying anti-Semitic presuppositions it entails and feeds has spread into democratic public spaces, within intellectual circles, among academics, the radical left, in various political parties, but especially in what were initially the fringes of the Labor Party. How this thinking moved from the fringes to the center of today's Labor Party, facilitating a crescendo of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, is the subject of the following two chapters. At the core of this analysis is the left-wing populist Jeremy Corbyn. As a chairman of Labor, he has de facto advanced institutional anti-Semitism and tolerated a culture of hostility toward Jews in the party. Corbyn is a former, little-known left-wing backbencher who spent decades in radical anti-imperialist groups, who founded the Stop the War Coalition and supports the Irish Republican movement, the Iranian regime, and the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who was elected leader of the Labour Party in 2015. Corbyn has called representatives of decidedly anti-Semitic terror organizations such as Hezbollah and Hamas his, quote, friends. He has donated money to the organization of Paul Eisen, a notorious Holocaust denier, and he defended and lauded anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists like Raed, I'm guessing that's how you say the name, R-A-E-D, Raed Salah, and Stephen Sizer against alleged Zionist smear campaigns. In 2013, Corbyn publicly stated that, quote, Zionists, having lived in this country for a very long time, probably all their lives, don't understand English irony, end quote. Yet Corbyn has always denied wholeheartedly that he, as an active leftist anti-racist, harbors any hostile feelings against Jews. Rather, he claims that he is, quote, totally opposed to any anti-Semitism whatsoever, end quote, and suggests any charge in this direction as, quote, disgusting and deeply offensive, end quote. Most importantly, Hirsch thoroughly demonstrates how with this change in leadership, Labor created and shielded institutional anti-Semitism, whereby tolerance of anti-Semitism indeed, quote, came to function as a marker of belonging, end quote. Entrenched in a hardened tribalistic logic of them versus us, and the worst of binary anti-Zionist ideological trajectories within the left, the issue of anti-Semitism, quote, has become pivotal, end quote, in defining who is inside and who is outside the Labor Party. Contrary to dominant democratic discourse in post-Holocaust Europe, Hirsch observes that within the Labor Party, opposition to anti-Semitism is no longer seen as an entry requirement into progressive politics. Rather, to ask, quote, if something said or done is anti-Semitic is to risk placing one's own membership of the community of the good under scrutiny, Anti-Semitism itself, on the other hand, when it can plausibly appear supportive of the Palestinians, does little to damage a person's reputation, end quote. This inversion within a left-wing European mainstream party constitutes a significant, dramatic step towards changing the boundaries of the speakable and to legitimize anti-Semitism. Indeed, as Roger Cohen argues the case of Labour, Britain's time-honored center-left party has become especially important as it is one of the main sources of rehabilitating anti-Semitism in mainstream European politics, as it is the first main center-left party to profoundly change the parameters of what appears as legitimate mainstream party discourse about Jews and, quote, Zionists, end quote. Hirsch shows that the toleration of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, an institutional climate of aggression and exclusion of Jewish critics, and the denial and downplaying of constantly recurring anti-Semitic incidents within Labor were also, unsurprisingly matched with Holocaust relativization. Hirsch's meticulous analysis of the, quote, Chakrabarti inquiry took place in 2016 in response to mounting public pressure and multiple cases of anti-Semitic abuse, gives little hope that this institutional climate could be meaningfully challenged from within. It was a less than thorough investigation into anti-Semitism within the Labour Party and, as Hirsch concludes, quote, evaded, quote, the key issues it needed to address, end quote. The next 3 chapters of contemporary left anti-Semitism turn to the academic world. They center especially on the nature, emergence, and evolution of the anti-Israel boycott movement, BDS, which, contrary to popular invented narratives, originated in the UK, not in Palestinian civil society, as Hirsch documents. BDS was initiated and invented by British activists and academics. The latter started to boycott Israeli students based on their nationality in the early 2000s, and then Israeli institutions of higher learning were targeted by the British Association of University Teachers, and finally by the new University and College Union, UCU. Hirsch carefully explores the steps, mechanisms, and meanings of the boycott campaign, which has led to a, quote, process of mainstreaming of anti-Zionism, end quote, in British academia, largely completed by 2009 and beyond. The groupthink currently dominant in the leadership of the Labour Party was an equally rigid and exclusive left-wing identity groupthink about Israel and, quote, Zionist power, end quote, in parts of academia and its unions. The institutionalized anti-Semitism in university unions, marginalizing, excluding, and attacking Jewish voices critical of the boycott movement, calling them Nazis, traitors to the cause, or worse, was accompanied by self-stylized, self-victimizing, heroic claims by members of the pro-boycott majority that they are, quote, not going to be intimidated, end quote, meaning intimidated by, quote, Zionist power, end quote. And from there, the boycott campaign's institutional anti-Semitism quickly spread to the United States. Geared toward the exclusion of Israeli colleagues and students, and only Israeli colleagues and students, the boycott campaign sees academic freedom as something that is part of Zionism's, quote, ideological armory, end quote, and can be sacrificed for the sake of defeating Zionism. This institutionalized anti-Semitism is rationalized ideologically by moral outrage about the Jewish state's very existence, claiming that Israel launches, quote, genocidal attacks against the Palestinian people, end quote. Jeremy Corbyn, is like Nazism, or constitutes a, quote, apartheid state, end quote, like the old South Africa. To say that Israel is like apartheid South Africa, quote, portrays Zionism only as a racist ideology of repression, end quote, and fundamentally delegitimizes Israel as a safe refuge for Jews, rather than criticizing any specific government policies. The now globally consolidated boycott campaign is involved in the anti-Semitic political project of singling out and demonizing Israel and only Israel. It suggests that the Jewish state, quote, was a unique racist evil on the planet, end quote, which, quote, cannot be allowed to continue to exist, end quote. This narrative follows the logic of anti-Semitism, which, Hirsch points out, has, quote, always thought of Jews as being decisive in everything bad that happens in this world, end quote. Hirsch provides many examples of where the anti-Zionist idea is unambiguously actualized in anti-Semitism on the left today. including blood libel narratives and conspiracy myths directed at Jews and the Jewish state. Still, by narrowly redefining anti-Semitism only as openly racial anti-Semitism or hostility against Jews as Jews, thus ignoring what I call the modernization of anti-Semitism, i.e., all tropes, stereotypes, and resentments articulated in coded and subtle ways, European and American advocates of BDS and other anti-Zionists see themselves as entirely free from anti-Semitism or prejudices against Jews. This does not stop them, Hirsch reminds us, from defaming Jewish critics for allegedly acting in bad faith in order to silence criticism of Israel, from holding Jews and Israelis globally responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, and even from downplaying the eliminationist anti-Semitism of organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, which Judith Butler's once included in the community of the good, the, quote, global left, end quote. This ideological construction and its justification within an anti-racist identity narrative, of course, presupposes both an a priori denial of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, as well as a significant inversion of the conceptualization of Jews. Instead of being recognized an oppressed, persecuted minority, as recognized by left-wing thinkers like Marx and Frantz Fanon, Jews are now construed as, quote, whitened. That is, they are fetishized as white oppressors, settler colonizers, and part of the Judeo-Christian white elite. Another element of this ideological construction, I would add, is a significant change in the perception of the causes of anti-Semitism. Whereas it is widely accepted within the anti-Zionist left that the Nazis and their predecessors made up wild conspiracy myths about the Jews in order to justify their persecution, today Jews do conspire and plot and commit genocidal crimes, the narrative goes, and hatred of Jews is simply a reflection of that reality. In this view, if there is still any anti-Semitism today, then it is the Jews' fault. Israel and the, quote, Zionist lobby, end quote, are now seen as the root cause of any remaining anti-Semitism in the world. And articulating this is construed as speaking, quote, truth to Zionist, quote, power, even if this view is shared by many in the, quote, community of the good, end quote, as well as by, quote, generations of anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists, end quote. Among the final chapters of Hirsch's study, dealing with issues such as anti-Zionism's discursive actualizations in the left, as well as questions of sociological method in approaching the subject of contemporary left anti-Semitism, the chapter, quote, on Jewish anti-Zionism, end quote, stands out. Here Hirsch offers a profound, sober, reflective analysis on how some Jews in the UK, Israel, and the United States have been drawn into the logic of anti-Semitism. Conscious of the fact that the political meaning of anti-Zionism has changed dramatically with the Holocaust and the foundation of Israel, Hirsch states that before 1939, quote, anti-Zionism was a position in debates among Jewish opponents of anti-Semitism, end quote. But after 1948, it became a program for the destruction of an actually existing state, end quote. Moreover, it is important to understand, as Hirsch does, that anti-Semitism is a social phenomenon, and thus being Jewish does not stop you from sharing socially relevant anti-Semitic views. Contrary to intersectional assumptions, The social identity one is born into does not necessarily increase the validity or truth value of one's ideas. Only against the backdrop of these two insights about the historically changing nature of anti-Zionism and the social nature of anti-Semitism can Jewish anti-Zionist anti-Semitism be grasped adequately. Political anti-Semitism among Jews, as Hirsch shows, is not a new phenomenon. However, it is in part distinctly configured and serves particular functions within the contemporary left. Hardly any Jews are anti-Zionist, Hirsch observes, but, quote, many anti-Zionists are Jews, end quote. In European societies and media, these Jewish anti-Zionists often pose as, quote, courageous dissidents who stand up against the fearsome threat of mainstream Zionist power, end quote, writes Hirsch. Characterizing concerns about anti-Semitism as a right-wing issue and denying anti-Semitism altogether as a serious problem, this fringe group of anti-Zionist Jews and their hatred of Israel plays a role, most importantly, in, quote, licensing, leading, and encouraging, end quote, movements which single out the Jewish state as the worst evil on the planet. When they speak, quote, as a Jew, end quote, they claim authenticity and direct this preface primarily towards non-Jews. Anthony Julius has demonstrated that there is a long tradition of anti-Semites deploying such Jewish witnesses against the, quote, Jews, end quote. In the case of the anti-Zionist parts of the contemporary left, however, such Jewish witnesses seem particularly important for upholding one's anti-racist credentials, even if one articulates free-floating anti-Semitic myths. The rise of public anti-Semitism on social media platforms and beyond has already inspired more of what Hannah Arendt has called a, quote, mob, and an alliance between mob and elite, more than Hirsch may assume. And it has, also on the left, increasingly transformed from more subtle, coded, civil or sophisticated expressions to the vulgar and openly abusive or violent forms that have traditionally been characteristic of the far right. Hirsch, to be sure, recognizes this path. He sees anti-Semitism as a political and social threat to Jews and to democracy, and he understands it as a forceful part of the populist surge, which in the UK has both clearly articulated right-wing and left-wing variants. Considering the emotional appeal of current populist movements and their intimate relationship with anti-Semitism, he warns at the end of the book that authoritarian populism requires enemies, quote, which are to be found at the center of dangerous, global, and powerful conspiracies, end quote. Contemporary left anti-Semitism has helped disseminate and propel such views into the streets and into mass culture. And it also plays its role in the global reemergence of violent Bierkeller anti-Semitism. While Hirsch fully understands that anti-Semitism is a global phenomenon, his study could have benefited from a more consistently and systematically comparative perspective. The study is largely confined to the British context. This context is of particular importance due to the role of the transformed Labour Party setting precedents on the center-left, and the role parts of British academia have played in mainstreaming anti-Zionism. However, a more rigorously European or global comparative perspective could have broadened the view and further deepened our understanding of specific contexts, agents, and causes within all Western democracies. For instance, it would have been helpful to thoroughly explore the peculiar role, mechanisms, and varying appeal of, quote, pinkwashing, end quote, accusations against Israel in the LGBT community, aggressively mobilized against the only LGBT-friendly state and society in the Middle East. In anti-Semitic circles, Israel is condemned regardless of what it does, if it denies rights and if it protects them. However, Hirsch's book offers an indispensable, thoughtful, critical, yet rigorously academic understanding of the origins of contemporary anti-Semitism on the left and how its appeal can be explained. The book is, simultaneously, a persuasive, quote, left-wing and democratic response to contemporary anti-Semitism, end quote. The Left, Anti-Semitism, and the Future of Democracy. The works by Fine and Spencer and Hirsch represent first and foremost serious scholarly inquiries into a still highly politically contested subject. They are, in Hannah Arendt's sense, quote, essays in understanding, end quote, the trajectories, contradictions, and complexities of anti-Semitism on the left. Both books are based on profound, sober, theoretical, and empirical analyses. Yet these two books also embody an engaged, historically informed contemporary critique of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism denial on the left, both of which remain widespread among left-wing publics, parties, movements, organizations, and even self-identified left-wing scholarly communities who claim immunity toward any anti-Jewish resentment. Consequently, these studies also imply a call for self-reflection. This call is as significant as it is largely ignored until this day. As these studies aptly demonstrate, because anti-Semitism remains very much alive, yet largely unacknowledged within the left. Indeed, many identifying with, quote, the left, end quote, do not seem to care if Jews are concerned about anti-Semitism, or if the Jewish state is singled out for boycotts and subjected to defamation campaigns invoking conspiracy myths about, quote, ruthless Zionist power, end quote. However, as Hirsch shows, the unqualified denial of anti-Semitism allows for its increasingly uncontrolled reproduction. When Jews are charged with raising allegedly illegitimate, quote, anti-Semitism charges, end quote, in bad faith against the left, the people, and Israel critics, the wrath is directed against the mostly Jewish messengers. Blaming Jews and the Jewish state for anti-Semitism, however, means reproducing the classic anti-Semitic trope that Jews, quote, had it coming, end quote, and that they are allegedly responsible for their own persecution. The works by these three scholars take several new directions in the study of anti-Semitism on the left. For instance, they recognize that post-colonialism and some post-national claims have functioned as a medium for a new kind of intolerance, a rather particularistic hostility against the Jewish state that blames all problems of nationalism and the nation-state on Israel, selectively and exclusively, as it alone is construed as the only nation-state ruled altogether unacceptable. In part, then, the left has functioned as a particularist catalyst for the legitimization and mainstreaming of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish conspiracy myths, personifying war and capitalism in partly subtle, partly open anti-Semitic tropes. By now, anti-Zionist anti-Semitism has arrived in democratic mainstream parties, like the British Labour Party and recently the Dutch GroenLinks, the first center-left party in Europe endorsing BDS. The particular return of the, quote, Jewish question is real, and so is the related threat to democracy as a whole. Both books force readers to face selective or, quote, distorted universalisms, end quote, at work, which cloak their own particularisms rather than openly assert them. Instead of taking part in the fight against anti-Semitism, distorted universalists, populist, and cultural relativists on the left, similar to those on the right, are largely warped by dogmatic ideological campism, nurtured by the left's worst traditions. If they launch an uninhibited attack on Israelis and the Jewish state with blind force, rather than criticizing specific policies, they are part and parcel of the current resurgence of anti-Semitism, And more often than not, they also use anti-Jewish stereotypes or even open denigrations of, quote, the Jews, end quote. Yet, these same people think of themselves simultaneously as morally righteous and completely free of anti-Jewish hostility. Moreover, the globalized political return of the anti-Jewish question on the left and far beyond points to the persistence of anti-Semitism as a, quote, undercurrent, end quote, Max Horkheimer, of the modern world under present-day political, social, and communicative conditions. All three authors help us better understand how this has happened. Among other things, they shed light on the relationship of anti-Semitism to the increasing social relevance of binary oppositions and reified cultural identity politics, which has not only spread on the right but also on the left and moved into the heart of the center. At the end of the day, in spite of some special anti-racist narratives grounding claims to moral righteousness, and some specific types of justifications mirroring distorted universalisms, there is very little that is specific about left anti-Semitism and its resurgence. Rather, the books indicate that Judeophobia on the left has to be understood within the context of broader developments of anti-Semitic conspiracy myths and anti-Jewish hostility in society. Today, considerable segments of the left take part in a resurgence of anti-Semitism and anti-democratic illiberal trends within democracies and in autocracies, in the erosion of what can be said about, quote, the Jews, end quote, in the public sphere without negative sanctions, in the growing appeal of conspiracy myths which almost inevitably lead to anti-Semitism, and in a related progressing decline of democratic cultures and norms in general. Less and less forced into subtle tropes or innuendo, anti-Semitism's broad-scale proliferation in the 21st century is reinforced by the emergence of a thinly veiled, but increasingly tolerated anti-Semitic code disseminated in the public from, quote, Zios to, quote, globalists. The latter is not anti-Semitic by definition and often used with no allusion to Jews, but can be traced back to an anti-Jewish trajectory since the 19th century, and is increasingly used again as a proxy in anti-Jewish discourses specifically targeting Jews. Both books, the aforementioned minor issues notwithstanding, open up the critical debate on contemporary anti-Semitism, challenge misperceptions, and illuminate often overlooked or misunderstood dimensions of contemporary Judeophobia. In particular, read together, these books take the debate on today's anti-Semitism, especially but not only on the left, to a new level of understanding. Undoubtedly, they are authoritative works of reference that will shape an overdue academic debate on the forms, significance, and origins of anti-Semitism. Thanks for listening.